They thought Africa could be bought. They thought Ibrahim Traoré was just another name they could place on their long list of allies for sale. But they were wrong, dangerously wrong. The IT began with a single letter. Not just a piece of paper, but a weapon disguised as diplomacy. Traoré, seated in his modest presidential office in Ouagadougou, was reviewing daily intelligence reports when one of his aides handed him a sealed envelope. Stamped with the words confidential diplomatic correspondence, it carried the kind of weight that makes the room fall silent. Inside was a proposal. A proposal so audacious, so insulting, that it revealed the world's greatest miscalculation about modern Africa. The letter offered Burkina Faso something staggering, over $1.2 billion. For a nation whose annual budget was less than that figure, it was an astronomical sum. But this wasn't aid. This wasn't investment. This was something far darker. The conditions were spelled out clearly. Stop speaking against Israel. Stop condemning its policies toward Palestine. Convince other African leaders to tone down their criticism. In return, not only would Burkina Faso's government receive billions, but Traoré himself would be shielded with limitless political and financial rewards. It didn't stop there. The letter dangled even more billions if he promised not to disrupt Israeli business networks across Africa. Energy contracts, mining interests, agricultural projects, an entire empire of influence that Tel Aviv wanted protected. They weren't just asking Traoré to be silent. They were asking him to become their spokesperson, their shield, their puppet in the African Union. But they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed Ibrahim Traoré was like the leaders before him. Leaders who signed deals in smoke-filled rooms. Leaders who exchanged dignity for dollars. Leaders who protected foreign businesses while their people lived in poverty. Traoré read the letter 3 times. His anger grew with each line. For him, this wasn't just a bribe, it was an insult to the revolution he had risked everything to lead. I did not overthrow a corrupt system, he muttered to his closest aides, just to become another extension of it. I am a soldier. A soldier does not abandon his mission for a suitcase of money. That mission was simple but uncompromising: African sovereignty, political, economic, and cultural independence. No more selling dignity for temporary relief. No more bowing to foreign masters disguised as partners. In the following days, Traoré noticed a pattern. Friendly advisors, respected diplomats from neighboring countries, even international officials, all began reaching out with subtle nudges. They painted glowing pictures: new hospitals, modern highways, advanced military equipment. They said Burkina Faso could become a regional giant overnight if only its president would silence his criticisms. Every conversation ended the same way: just ease your stance on Israel. Say less about Palestine. Think of the benefits. That was the moment it became clear. This was not one letter. This was a coordinated campaign. Powerful forces had been studying Traoré, calculating what might make him surrender. But they had underestimated his resolve, and so Traoré chose a path no one expected. Instead of negotiating quietly, instead of filing the letter away in secrecy, he called a press conference. The world's cameras watched as the young African leader held up the letter and read it aloud. Every word, every condition, every bribe. The silence that followed was not just in that room. It rippled across the continent. For the first time in decades, an African leader had exposed in public what many only whispered in private. The global powers were treating Africa as a marketplace, not a continent of sovereign nations. They believe our dignity has a price tag, Traoré declared, his voice steady but burning with conviction. They believe African leaders are commodities to be purchased. They believe we exist to protect their business networks while our people starve. Today, we prove them wrong. Those words shook capitals around the world. Tel Aviv reportedly descended into panic. Netanyahu himself was said to be furious, realizing a carefully crafted operation had been demolished in minutes. French diplomats scrambled, fearing their own African dealings would come under similar scrutiny. American envoys quietly sought clarification, wondering if this marked the beginning of something far larger. But the most powerful reaction didn't come from governments. It came from the people. Within hours, the phrase "Africa is not for sale" was trending across social media in 14 African countries. Students organized marches demanding transparency in foreign contracts. Youth groups in Ghana and Kenya launched online campaigns questioning their government's deals with foreign powers. Artists painted murals in West African cities, portraying Traoré as a symbol of resistance against exploitation. In South Africa, A prominent journalist called his speech a masterclass in dignified leadership. Across university campuses in Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal, young Africans shared clips of his words, using them as rallying cries for a new generation. They began calling themselves the uncompromised generation. For decades, African leaders had been pressured, silenced, and bought. But this time was different. One young leader had turned down billions, not in secret, but in the bright light of day, and he had done it on behalf of his continent. The shockwaves were immediate. Mali announced it was reviewing every Israeli contract. Niger recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. Chad froze diplomatic discussions. Ghana, known for its neutrality, publicly supported Burkina Faso's stance. Foreign powers were stunned. This was no longer a single leader standing alone. This was the beginning of a continental awakening, and it all started with a simple refusal. One soldier, one president, choosing to expose the truth rather than sell his people's dignity. As Traoré left the press conference that day, one reporter shouted, "Mr. President, aren't you afraid of the consequences?" He stopped, turned to the cameras, and gave an answer that echoed far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. "The only thing I fear is silence, because silence is what keeps us in chains. As long as I breathe, Africa will not be for sale." The crowd erupted. And from that moment, the continent would never be the same again. The revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's explosive press conference, the world's media scrambled to cover the story. Headlines flashed across every major news network. African leader exposes $1.2 billion bribe, Traoré declares. Africa is not for sale. Tel Aviv caught in diplomatic scandal for years. Whispers of such deals had haunted African politics, but never before had anyone dared to read them aloud in front of cameras. What Traoré had done was more than just courageous, it was revolutionary. But the story didn't end with exposure. In fact, this was only the beginning. Because the moment Traoré tore the veil off the bribe, the pressure against him doubled. Behind closed doors, diplomats and foreign envoys began their damage control. American officials, who had carefully avoided taking sides on Israel's African outreach, suddenly found themselves cornered. Questions swirled in Washington. Did the U.S. know? Was America complicit? Or had Israel acted alone? In Paris, the French establishment burned with embarrassment. France had lost much of its grip on West Africa in recent years, and now one of the youngest presidents in the region had humiliated a close European ally. Leaked French intelligence memos even suggested that Paris had quietly encouraged Israel's financial diplomacy in Africa. Now those whispers were turning into accusations, and in Tel Aviv there was chaos. Reports claimed that Prime Minister Netanyahu summoned his inner circle for an emergency midnight meeting. The proposal to Traoré had been part of a broader strategy, one designed to secure Africa's silence on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the United Nations. If Africa stayed quiet, Israel could pass resolutions, expand alliances, and strengthen its global legitimacy. But Traoré had blown apart years of planning in one afternoon. While governments panicked, ordinary Africans felt something different, pride. Across Ouagadougou, citizens filled the streets, chanting Traoré's name. "We are not for sale," became the anthem echoing from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Local musicians even began composing songs around his speech, their lyrics celebrating a leader who had done what many thought impossible, standing up to billions and saying no to Burkina Faso's universities. Students spoke of Traoré as if he were the rebirth of Thomas Sankara. Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987, had long been remembered for his integrity and his refusal to sell Africa's dignity. Now young Africans were drawing a direct line. Sankara had dreamed it, Traoré was living it. But as admiration grew, so did the threats. Within days of his announcement, Traoré's intelligence service detected unusual activity. Foreign operatives suspected to be linked to Mossad were reportedly spotted in Ouagadougou. Anonymous letters began arriving, warning him to retract his words or face consequences. Cyber attacks targeted Burkina Faso's government websites, attempting to erase videos of the press conference. Yet every attempt backfired. The more they tried to silence him, the more viral his message became. Clips of his speech were translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, and English. On TikTok alone, hashtags like #AfricaNotForSale and #StandWithTraoré gathered millions of views within a week. In Washington, Donald Trump, known for his blunt words, was asked during a radio interview what he thought of Traoré's refusal. His response stunned many. "Well, I'll tell you, he's a tough guy. They offered him billions, and he said no. That's pretty strong." Most people would take the money. Most leaders would take the money. But he didn't. Very strong. Very interesting. The mention of Traoré by a former U.S. president electrified global headlines. Suddenly, this was no longer a regional story. It was global. It was about a young African leader standing at the center of a clash between morality and money. Back in Africa, other leaders began to feel the heat. Citizens in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya started demanding answers. Have our leaders been approached too? Became a question on everyone's lips. Journalists dug deep, uncovering suspicious deals, unexplained foreign investments, and sudden shifts in foreign policy. Traoré had not only refused the bribe, he had opened a door to scrutiny that terrified elites across the continent. And yet, through all of this, Traoré remained calm. In his weekly radio address, he spoke not with anger, but with conviction. They will try to divide us. They will try to tempt us. They will try to intimidate us. But what they forget is this: Africa has awakened. And once a people awaken, they cannot be bought back to sleep. His words resonated deeply. Ordinary citizens felt seen, felt heard, felt defended. But in foreign capitals, those words were seen as a declaration of war. Tel Aviv quietly suspended all official contact with Burkina Faso. Aid packages that had been promised were frozen. International banks suddenly flagged transactions involving the country as high risk. Foreign contractors began to withdraw from infrastructure projects, citing instability. It was clear Traoré's refusal came with a price. But it was also clear that he had no intention of backing down. In fact, insiders reveal that Traoré had begun reaching out to leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea to form what he called a shield of integrity, a bloc of African nations that would collectively reject foreign manipulation. The plan was bold: create a united front so strong that no single leader could be isolated or pressured into compliance. The dream was risky, but the momentum was undeniable. African youth were ready. Civil societies were ready. And in a rare moment, even rival governments were considering working together. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting to the world. The world was reacting to Africa. And at the center of it all stood one man, Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who refused to sell his soul. The days following Traoré's revelation felt like a storm sweeping across the continent. What began as a scandal involving one letter quickly morphed into a continental reckoning. For the first time in decades, the question wasn't whether Africa would respond to the world's agenda, but whether the world could keep up with Africa's response. Burkina Faso's streets remained alive with chants, but now the ripple was everywhere. In Lagos, Nigerian students marched with banners that read, "Our dignity is not for sale." In Nairobi, young Kenyans spray-painted murals of Traoré alongside Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah, leaders who once dreamed of a sovereign Africa. In Johannesburg, musicians held a free concert under the banner, "One Africa, One Voice." The message was clear. Traoré's refusal was no longer his alone. It belonged to every African who had felt their country treated as a marketplace rather than a homeland. But while Africa celebrated, foreign powers scrambled. In Washington, officials were alarmed. The U.S. State Department quietly dispatched envoys to African capitals, urging leaders not to escalate tensions. But in leaked audio, one diplomat admitted, "If this spreads, we lose leverage. And if we lose leverage, China wins." We can't let Traoré set the tone for the continent. In Paris, frustration boiled over. France, already losing influence in West Africa, now faced open mockery. French media outlets admitted that young Africans were calling France the Empire of Silence, a reference to its history of buying loyalty through aid. President Emmanuel Macron reportedly phoned several African leaders, urging them to remain pragmatic. Few listened, and in Tel Aviv, the backlash was unprecedented. Opposition parties accused Netanyahu of recklessness. How could a secret bribe be so carelessly exposed? One Israeli newspaper wrote bluntly, "Burkina Faso has turned her strategy into a global embarrassment." But while politicians argued, African youth were busy turning defiance into organization. On social media, a grassroots coalition was forming. Students from 14 countries announced a new Pan-African movement, the Uncompromised Generation. Their manifesto was simple: no secret deals, no foreign bribes, no leaders for sale. They demanded every African government publish details of foreign contracts, aid packages, and business agreements. Within a week, their hashtag Uncompromised Africa had surpassed 50 million views. Suddenly, African leaders felt cornered. not by foreign powers, but by their own people. In Ghana, students forced parliament to debate a $400 million foreign loan deal. In Kenya, protests demanded the government reveal the terms of a recent military contract. In Senegal, activists began publishing leaked documents showing how foreign fishing companies had been plundering their seas. Traoré's act of defiance had little match. Now Africa was on fire with demands for transparency. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso itself became a symbol. International investors pulled back, predicting collapse. But instead of collapse, something remarkable happened. African nations began to step in. Mali announced it would double grain exports to Burkina Faso. Nigeria signed a new oil-sharing agreement. South Africa sent engineers to help with energy projects. What foreign powers had withdrawn, Africans themselves began to replace. It was as if the continent had decided, if they won't help us without strings, we will help each other. But with unity came retaliation. Burkina Faso's financial system suddenly came under attack. International banks flagged routine transactions as suspicious. Global institutions delayed promised funds. The country's credit rating was downgraded overnight. Inside his cabinet, some of Traoré's ministers panicked. "Mr. President," one advisor reportedly told him, "they are trying to strangle us. We should consider negotiating quietly." But Traoré refused. "Negotiation is what they expect," he said. "They believe our dignity can be bent with pressure. If we yield now, every young African watching will know we were lying when we said Africa is not for sale." Instead of retreating, Traoré escalated. He announced the creation of a National Transparency Commission, a body tasked with publishing every major contract Burkina Faso had signed in the last 20 years. He invited journalists and activists to sit on the commission. He dared foreign companies to object, and object they did. Mining giants, agricultural exporters, telecom corporations, all lobbied fiercely to block the move. But by then, the political momentum was unstoppable. To resist transparency was to appear guilty. By the time the first report was published, the continent was stunned. Deals worth billions had been signed with virtually no oversight. Contracts for gold mines, oil fields, and agricultural land had given away more wealth in 1 decade than Burkina Faso had earned in half a century. The outrage was volcanic. Citizens demanded renegotiation. Some even demanded expulsion of foreign companies. But here was the surprise. Rather than fleeing, many corporations chose to adapt. They realized that resisting transparency would only damage their long-term prospects. Some offered to renegotiate. Others pledged to invest more in local communities. For the first time, fair partnership looked like the safer path. Meanwhile, Traoré's reputation soared. He was no longer just Burkina Faso's president. He was Africa's new voice of defiance. Western media called him reckless, naive, even dangerous. But in Africa, he was being called something else, the uncompromised soldier, and perhaps the most telling moment came when Nelson Mandela's grandson, Mandla Mandela, publicly praised Traoré. "My grandfather once said, 'We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians.' Today, Traoré reminds us that our freedom is also incomplete if Africa itself remains for sale." The symbolism was powerful. The struggle of Africa and the struggle of Palestine were now being spoken of in the same breath, united by one soldier's refusal to sell his continent's dignity. But as Traoré's star rose, so too did the dangers. Intelligence sources began whispering of assassination plots. Anonymous threats multiplied. One European diplomat was overheard saying, if they cannot buy him, they may try to remove him. Burkina Faso's streets remained full of celebration, but also vigilance. Citizens organized voluntary patrols, determined to protect their president. Murals appeared overnight with one phrase painted across walls: "Touch Traoré, and you touch Africa." The stage was set. This was no longer just a scandal. It was becoming a continental movement. And for the first time in living memory, Africa wasn't waiting for the world's permission. IT was writing its own rules. The world was holding its breath. What began as a single bribe rejected in Ouagadougou had spiraled into a confrontation between old powers and a rising Africa. By now, it wasn't simply about Traoré. It was about the dignity of a continent, the awakening of a generation, and the rewriting of a global order. In Burkina Faso, the capital was transformed. Young volunteers patrolled the streets, not with weapons, but with whistles and walkie-talkies, guarding against rumors of assassination attempts. Across walls and buses, one slogan appeared again and again: "Protect Traoré, protect Africa." And still, Traoré did not hide. In one of the boldest moves yet, he gave a televised address standing in the middle of a crowded marketplace. No presidential palace, no guarded office, just him surrounded by the people. They think pressure will break us, he declared. But it is not pressure that breaks iron. It is fire that forges it. Today, Burkina Faso is forged by fire, and we are not alone. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Cape Town to Cairo, Africa is watching. And together, Africa is rising. The crowd roared, their cheers echoing across the streets. For ordinary citizens, it was not just a speech, it was a vow. But elsewhere, corridors of power grew darker. Intelligence chatter leaked of covert plans. Reports emerged of foreign operatives meeting with opposition figures. Anonymous leaflets circulated, warning Traoré's government of serious consequences if it did not change course. Yet the threats only hardened resolve when rumors spread that Traoré might be targeted during an upcoming regional summit. Thousands of Burkinabe youth announced they would accompany him, forming a human shield. Their message was clear. If you strike at him, you strike at all of us. And then came the unexpected twist. Traoré was not isolated. He was inspiring alliances, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, all led by young leaders who had rejected Western influence, announced a joint pact. They called it the Alliance of Sovereign States, a coalition built on mutual defense, resource sharing, and transparency. Soon, whispers emerged that other nations, Chad, Ghana, even Tanzania, were considering joining. For decades, Africa had been divided by borders drawn in European capitals. Now unity was being forged not in colonial boardrooms but on African soil, in African languages, for African survival. The symbolism shook the world. In Washington, policymakers grew frantic. If they create a united economic bloc, our leverage disappears, one analyst warned. In Paris, editorialists lamented, we are witnessing the birth of an Africa that no longer needs us. In Tel Aviv, officials debated damage control, but the scandal was too vast. Meanwhile, the streets of Africa were alive with unprecedented hope. For the first time in living memory, young Africans believed that change wasn't just possible, it was happening before their eyes. But hope was tested quickly. Global financial institutions retaliated, freezing development funds and tightening restrictions on African exports. Burkina Faso's economy trembled. Fuel prices rose. Food imports slowed. The pressure was suffocating. Yet in those difficult weeks, something remarkable unfolded. Africa turned to itself. Nigerian oil tankers supplied fuel at discounted rates. Ghana sent rice shipments across the border. South African doctors volunteered to strengthen Burkina Faso's health system. Where once foreign powers stepped in, Africans themselves filled the gap. And in the midst of this struggle, Traoré spoke again, this time addressing not just his own people, but the entire continent. Brothers and sisters of Africa, every empire has told us we cannot stand without them. But today, when they close their doors, you open yours. This is what unity looks like. This is what sovereignty feels like. And let the world hear it clearly. Africa is not for sale. The speech went viral. Millions watched it across YouTube, TikTok, and television. In Nairobi, people gathered in cafes just to replay his words. In Accra, university students printed his quotes on their shirts. In Cairo, protesters held up banners with his face. Traoré was no longer a politician. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols are powerful. The more powerful he became, the more dangerous he was to the old order. International think tanks began openly speculating. Would Traoré survive his term? Was he too radical to last? But in Africa, the narrative was different. For the people, the question was no longer whether Traoré would survive. The question was, would Africa let him fall? And the answer, everywhere from Dakar to Addis Ababa, was becoming clearer. As the year drew to a close, something historic happened. At the African Union Summit, a resolution was passed calling for greater financial independence, stricter transparency in foreign deals, and united bargaining power in global forums. It was not everything Traoré had dreamed of, but it was a beginning to a new Africa was taking shape, not overnight, not without struggle, but step by step, and through it all, one lesson echoed louder than any other, that dignity cannot be bought, that freedom cannot be bribed, and that the courage of one leader can awaken the courage of millions. And Ouagadougou, the murals remained. On walls, buses, even school notebooks, for simple words told the story of a new era. Africa is not for sale. And as the credits of history began to write themselves, Traoré stood not just as a president, but as a symbol of an uncompromised generation. So as you watch this story unfold, remember, this is not just about one man or one bribe. It is about a continent finding its voice, a continent that refuses to be silenced, a continent that has decided its future will not be dictated, but written by its own people. And if you believe in this vision, if you believe Africa deserves to stand tall, proud, and free, then join this journey with us. Support voices that tell the truth, that refuse compromise, and that bring Africa's story to the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because together, we are not just watching history, we are making it.